Hello, hello. Welcome to part 3 of Developer Essentials. My name is Matt Rosno. With me today, the one, the only, Vince Picone. What's up? Hi, Vince.
Hello.
So this is part of Fed at IBM, front-end development at IBM Educational or Educational series. And a couple reminders before we get going today. So number one, this is recorded because it is on YouTube. Number two, if you entered YouTube directly instead of going through Your Learning, you can go back to Your Learning and manually mark attendance for attendance purposes. Number three, let me switch over here. So here's where you can mark for the attendance for the introduction sessions here. We also have labs, around 10 in-person labs going on to do hands-on coding sessions. We do that here in Austin Wednesday mornings. And so let me just show those to everybody like last time. If you're able to show up, please do. It's a party. It's a great way to lend a helping hand or to get help yourself as we go through this carbon material. So before we jump into step 3, let's just do a little recap of what we've currently done so far. So if this is new, this Developer Essentials is about the carbon design system. Specifically, we're working on our React components and building a React app. So if you're coming in and have not done the previous steps yet, I recommend that you go to the tutorial overview to see any sort of prerequisites and things to get familiar with before you jump in. Now you can go and start directly with step 3. Things make the most sense if you do them sequentially, but do that as you please. So it seems like everybody got through step 2 relatively well. In step 2, we installed the grid. We built out these static pages. Using breadcrumb components, different type tokens, color tokens, spacing tokens, the tab component, then also a static data table. And today we're going to be populating that static data table with data coming from the GitHub API. I would say midweek, last week we released 10.3, and that happened to have a couple unintentional breaking changes in the tutorial. So just to quickly speak to those, once you go here, you'll notice that things look a little different in the UI shell. The focus states have a white outline, and the color of these top-level links look to be a little different. There's a nice little vertical separator here, if you can see that. And so within, let me switch over to the Carbon tutorial repo that we're working out of. In index.scss, we have a number of overrides, and these are just things that need to be fixed upstream. When 10.3 was released with updates to the UI shell, that took the UI shell from experimental status to officially supported you can use it status. And one unintended consequence was there is a padding on BX content, and it's unclear to me if that's intentional or unintentional or really what's going on there. So I created a quick issue for it, and I updated our index.scss with just clearing that out so the tutorial works as expected for that. The other thing that you may have came across when using 10.3 is an import was removed for some of our type classes, specifically with font family. So a number of you discovered this, but we updated the instructions so that you can import the font family .scss file directly. And so I believe that was breaking. Let me switch back over to our landing page styling. If you got an error, let me pull it up. If you got an error and it was complaining about this include for carbon font weight, once you go ahead and add that import in app.scss, that will resolve that. So yeah, as a reminder, we have the Carbon Slack or Carbon-tutorial Slack channel. Keep up the questions, keep up the help. And at this point, let me turn it over to Vince to give you a preview of what we're doing this week.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, this is a really fun. It was a really fun lesson to write. We're really starting to get into using real world data with Carbon components, and so you get to see what fleshing out a real application would be like. And we opted to use the GitHub API this go around so that we could interact with some Carbon related data, but it also gives you experience into using what's called GraphQL, which is a new way of fetching data. It's kind of a corollary to like REST APIs, except you kind of tell the API exactly what data you want, and it will return to you either an error if you requested something that isn't possible, or just your data in exactly the way you described it. So real quick, if you're not very familiar with GraphQL, that's totally okay. We end up providing you the exact query you need to get the data you need and how to interact with it. GitHub is made as a first-class citizen, their V4 API, which is a GraphQL API. And so if you want to, you can play around a little bit with the GitHub GraphQL API. They provide this explorer here. Your first time going to it, there's a link in the tutorial, but you can see the URL up here. The first time you go to it, you're going to log in. That's one thing that we cover in the tutorial as well, is like if you want to make requests to the GitHub API, you have to authenticate. So we go over a little bit about authentication, how to sign up for a token, how to provide that token in a React application, or create React application specifically. And so if you're not familiar with GraphQL, haven't used it before, it's really simple and straightforward. It's a lot of fun to write. Basically, this is you supply an object. Viewer is the GraphQL or GitHub's way of saying the person that's actively logged in right now. And then, so for login, you'll say, okay, so I got a login. Now say I want to get my bio, I want my company, and I can also get repositories contributed to. So this is unique in that like these are all like specific values. So it's going to return with either a string, a number, or what have you. You'll notice that this is underlined. It says it must have a selection of subfields. That means that this is also an object. So with GraphQL, we can go a little bit deeper, and now we can get raw values from here. One of my like killer features for GraphQL for me is that sometimes exploring APIs is really tough. So for here, when you're in this little graphical explorer, you can hit Control Space, and it'll tell you all of the things that you can query. So we'll get the total count, and then if you look back on Viewer, you can see all of the different fields that are available to me, like the URL, right? So if we just hit the play button, you'll see we have all of the data we asked for, exactly parsed as needed. There's no need when you get your data returned to you to do null checks or undefined checks or what have you. It's kind of GraphQL's contract with you, the developer, is that if there's no errors, we've done our job, and you can assume that the data is populated. So that's our little GraphQL intro. There's have some plenty of resources here on how to get more familiar with GitHub's API and GraphQL in general. In order to use this in our application, we use a few helper libraries, and they are all from the Apollo platform, which is kind of when you hear people talking about GraphQL and React apps, or really GraphQL in front-end applications now, they're talking about Apollo. They have provided a key set of like features and helper libraries that have really defined and like contributed to the overall like uptake of GraphQL in front-end applications and applications at large. So the one competitor that they would have, and it was an alternative to integrating this React app, would be Relay, which is from Facebook, and is also doing great things for solving solutions a little bit more specific to Facebook. Maybe it's a little bit lower level. We can get started though with our application with just these three requirements. Apollo Boost includes almost everything you need from Apollo's end to wrap your application and get started with being able to access your data throughout your application. GraphQL, this is obviously a GraphQL library that parses your queries. You'll notice like later on when you paste the query into like your text editor or what have you, if you've installed for VS Code like a GraphQL plugin, you'll get all the fancy text highlighting, syntax highlighting that we kind of got in graphical right there. And then finally, well, I should mention, this is a library that takes a string literal, like backticks. If any of you guys are familiar with style components or things like that, you basically just say GraphQL backtick, and you write your query inside of those backticks. So it's important that you grab those backticks and use it like we do in the code snippet a little bit later. Finally, we have React Apollo, and this is the way of integrating your application with Apollo. Just like there is like Angular integrations and Ember integrations, Apollo has wherever you, the front-end developer, are writing your code, they can meet you there with this final like implementation wrapper. So yeah, we cover creating the access token, and we cover wrapping your library with connecting to Apollo. We pass in our authorization code, and this is where we use the environmental variable. Later on, we get to like kind of motivations for why we're using GraphQL at all. One really nice thing is that we can make requests in wrapping our application with the React Apollo. We can make requests from anywhere inside of our library using Apollo's query component. Uses render props, which we go over. And basically, when you use that query, you're going to either get an error or a loading state, and then finally your data. So if there's an error, that means we can't assume that anything's populated in our data. Something's gone wrong. We log it out. When it's loading, we get to use the skeleton, the data table skeleton that comes from Carbon Components React. And then finally, we're going to actually go through the process of generating content to fill our data table with the real response from GitHub's API. So yeah, the components that we cover are the skeleton data table itself, and then also the pagination component. We go over common data table missteps. These are things that we probably get at least 2 or 3 times a week in our Slack channel, is how to properly use the data table, and common like errors, I would say, in that render props aren't necessarily the most familiar pattern for a lot of React developers. So we go over that in detail. We start to cover things like the integration of data table and pagination. A lot of people assume that you can just like put the data table up and then put the pagination there and it should just work. That's not necessarily the case, because there's things like, how do we determine like going to the next page? What does that entail? How are we slicing our data? If we're sorting it, how do we do that in a way that makes sense for the pagination? The pagination is kind of like a dumb component in essence, that it's just presentational, right? And so you have to supply it an on-change handler, and you have to give it a little bit more information so that it can be truly like integrated with your data table. Overarching just kind of concepts that we cover. You'll notice that the repo page is separated from the repo table. This is a really common and awesome pattern for making clean React applications. You want to separate your data fetching and data processing away from the presentational component. This is something that's going to make it very easy for you to go on and say, oh, wait, something isn't rendering properly, like it doesn't look right, then I'm going to go to the repo table. If something's like I'm not fetching the right data, or the data is like giving me the wrong links, is giving me the homepage link instead of the GitHub link, that's going to be your repo page. You're going to like investigate your query. Real quick, I just kind of wanted to go over our query that we're grabbing, and kind of we commented a little bit, but we're going to grab the organization, which again is like a big object. You do parentheses, login, Carbon Design System. This is your way of passing information to GraphQL as if it were like a REST parameter. We're going to say repositories, get the first 75. We're going to give an initial order and the direction, descending. we need the total count so that we can appropriately tell our pagination component, how many total pages there are going to be. And we grab things to actually, this is when we go nodes. This is how you're telling GraphQL. Basically, I'm expecting an array, and this is what I want from each individual object. I want the URL, homepage URL. That's the GitHub URL and the actual website, respectively. I want the issues, specifically only the open issues, and I want the total count. I want these are the amount of people that have starred the repository or stargazers, the releases, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can see too, one thing I didn't mention is that when you're exploring this, the control space to get the autocomplete isn't the only way of exploring a GitHub API. You can quite literally come over here to this thing called the Documentation Explorer, which is the way that you can kind of look up, and it gives you individual information. So I can click on things like organization, and that's telling you I need to give it a string, and these are all the different information that you can get. You can see really dive deep into the information that's available to you. So it's a great way to integrate with APIs if your API supports a GraphQL server that allows this kind of interaction. It's a really fun way to write applications. I think it's a really fun way to use Carbon components. So yeah, we cover pretty much all of the hiccups that people have with data table. Another common one is, you might pass in these big, huge globs of data to the data table, but the data table is going to strip out any unnecessary information that it's not actively displaying in the tab. So for things like our descriptions that are hidden in rows, we need to write a little helper function to get that information from our data object. And so that's a section that a lot of people have issues with. They're like, okay, why I'm rendering all my rows, but some of my data is not there. How do I use that? So the last bit of information I would say is, I got distracted by the lazy suspense question. That's really cool. Right, so hooks. So we're using hooks in this project. So React hooks are relatively brand new in the scope of like big changes that come to React. It's a way for you to write your components without using classes, and for a lot of people, it's a much more cleaner way of getting and fetching data. You're not relying on the lifecycle methods like component did mount, component will unmount, and the cleanup. It's a much cleaner API. Once I started writing hooks, I kind of never went back, and we're using just the bare minimum kind of use state, those things we link to resources on getting started with hooks. I think that's about it. There's if you're not comfortable with hooks, you're not comfortable with GraphQL, that's okay. We go over all the basics there, and provide for you basically the essentials and resources that you need to get started with that. But yeah, I'm really excited for everyone to get started with the tutorial. We worked really hard on it, and I think it's going to hopefully be a great resource for people that are using the data table specifically with more data-heavy applications. And hopefully we'll get some people interested in GraphQL and the integration with Carbon components. So yeah.
Do you want to scroll up to the top?
Sure.
And open up the preview link in a new tab, and just
the preview link.
Scroll down a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, all of our work is going to live here. And yeah, so you see the data table skeleton got rendered while we were loading our application, while we were fetching the data. You'll see that we have items per page. We have a total of 47 items. This, remember, we get from the total number of items. You can change the number here. You can do pages. So the question in regards to, or was there something else you wanted me to show on the
No, I
here?
just wanted to show off the first time it loads.
Yeah.
And then, if you were to go back to the homepage route and then, back to the repositories. route, how that's all cached in memory.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and that's another advantage of using Apollo is they have a beautiful kind of seamless integration with caching that is abstracted away from you. In the future, with things like React Cache, this is going to be something that's fully supported by React. But as React is releasing like lower level API implementations, these are things that helpers like Apollo Boosts, and all their like suite of front end assets are really kind of taking advantage of those things and helping us as front end developers not necessarily abstract them away, but make them usable in a way that you it's a more seamless, like easier developer experience. But you can see here, so this is an example of all the data that we're passing in. We're passing in all of this row data, but there's no description column necessarily. So when we click here and we want to see the description, this isn't assigned to any cell, so the data table isn't going to like make it available on the row object when we're rendering out our rows. So that's when the little helper function comes into play, and that's a really common misstep that we're hoping we can help them solve with this tutorial. But yeah, as far as making use of lazy and suspense, so yeah, React Lazy is more so used for code splitting and bringing in components as you need them, so it's not necessarily applicable here. Suspense is absolutely, we're not using that here. We're using the built-in caching service from Apollo GraphQL. Really, Suspense is meant to be used with some sort of cache. So if you wanted to implement your own sort of behavior to emulate what's going on with Apollo, you would have to bring in React Cache, which isn't fully ready in production yet. That's something that the React team is still working on. So Apollo really nicely bundles up this kind of interacting with data in such a way that it feels like you get a suspense experience, and that you're giving it a fallback when you say loading, fallback, and then finally when our data is ready, that's when we're going to be rendering the data table. So in many ways, it's not going to be such a dissimilar API from using Suspense. The only difference is that we don't have to go so low level as using not production ready features. Apollo is battle tested and ready to go. So we wanted to, especially when we're pushing the boundaries a little bit using GraphQL at all, we really wanted to stay within the realm of libraries that I think I would feel comfortable recommending using in a production application. So yeah, mutations. They are trickier than queries. Yeah, absolutely. So Apollo has some absolutely, just like they have a query component, they also have a mutation component that makes them actually not trickier than queries. They're very simple to write, a lot of fun. The reason why we didn't get into them is because it's not necessarily Carbon related. Sure, we could have a button here that allows you, the viewer, to like it, but at the end of the day, like writing a mutation component and then making sure that we have the special permissions necessary to do that, I felt that it wasn't really Carbon specific. At the end of the day, we want this to be a demonstration of how to use data table appropriately, how to use a skeleton as a fallback, and yeah, we felt like that we're pushing the boundaries a little bit using GraphQL at all, so trying to keep it simpler. One really cool thing I forgot to mention with Suspense is that Suspense is going to allow you to do something like selectively render fallbacks. So like that took a little bit of time for the first data skeleton to render, for our query to fetch, and for it to populate. So we for sure would have shown a skeleton there. Amazon and a lot of other companies have done studies, and this is something that you guys should look into when you're using the skeleton and using the data table or any of our other skeletons when you're asynchronously loading data. Amazon has done studies that show that if you render a skeleton or a spinner or a loading immediately, show the user that immediately, and then right after that, maybe 200-300 milliseconds, anywhere under a second, if you actually populate the data, that the experience actually feels slower than if you had just hold it off and then rendered the data table when it was ready. The jarring kind of experience of going from loading to not loading, it feels like the website's jankier. It feels like it's loading, much slower. So the suspense is going to let us do things like, say, hold off for 600 milliseconds. If after 600 milliseconds we still don't have our data, then show the data table skeleton, then show the data. That's something that kind of like fine tuning and of experience is something that we're really looking forward to from like a Carbon design system perspective, assisting people with appropriately rendering skeletons. For now, we just render the skeleton immediately. We assume that if it's loading, we want to show the data table skeleton. There are ways right now that you can implement that kind of behavior, hacky, like set timeouts, but this is the most simple application that we could come up with, and that's, I guess, a kind of roundabout way of saying why Suspense it's really exciting, but just not quite there yet. So.
Another question if you want to get to that one.
Yeah, sure. So the tree structure is, for example, when you expand Carbon Components React in your example, it would show records that are children of the expanded row. Yeah, so this is, we have kind of a funny chart on our wall in Carbon Design System whenever someone asks for a nested component, like a data table inside of a data table, we like reset the number back to 0 days. It's a asked for feature, but you can imagine that with the wide variety of complexity in tree structures, all the way from a 100% data table nested within the inside of a data table, all the way to just a little bit more information, a little bit more drop down. That's not something that we support right now. The tree view is something that other business units at IBM here have been very interested in, and so it's kind of we're considering it as a prototype for like a community supported, community contributed component, and we're like actively looking for contributions in that regard. Something that comes up a lot with Carbon is like, how do I get a component to be part of Carbon? And the thing is that we have 4, 5, 6 designers that are actively working on like drawing out these kind of beautiful, elegant components, and then we have developers that are meant to support that component in perpetuity. So to get a component in the libraries, we really need buy-in from people that intend on supporting it in perpetuity in the future. So all that to say is no, we don't display tree data structures, but it's something, the tree view is something that is heavily asked for. And so when you do this expand row, you have pure control over what shows up here. So right now we're just displaying a paragraph. But if you were to devise your own display that, say instead of just getting the description, you got, the description plus the core contributors and what have you, you could display whatever you want in this table expand row. It's kind of an empty canvas. So while we don't support tree view natively, that's absolutely something that you could build to suit your application's needs and your data visualization needs and throw it into this expand row to create kind of charts or what have you. It's really an open canvas. Cool. So what if you can't predict how long it will take to load data based on data set size and computer loading speeds? Okay, so you're assuming you're talking a little bit about Suspense and the kind of like the pause there. So the beauty of GraphQL is that with the caching both on server side, mainly on the server side with the GraphQL servers, you're not so much reliant on the data size, and this is going to depend on your exact implementation. But the data size is returned to you is just kind of what you can hold in memory, but you're never meant to predict how long it will take to load data. What you're doing is telling Suspense the maximum amount of time that I want my users to look at a blank white unrendered screen is 600 milliseconds. I'm kind of just pulling that number out. That's not set in stone, but 600 milliseconds. After that, render the data table skeleton. You're not trying to adjust that buffer based on the size or scope. If say that fetch does take longer, that just means that it's a higher likelihood that they'll eventually hit 600 milliseconds. Will eventually be shown the skeleton, and we'll eventually have to wait. There's all sorts of bailouts you can do after a certain amount of time, and all these things are coming or soon to come on. In the React core library with Suspense and React Cache. Let's see.
We are at the top of the half hour.
Okay, what does that mean?
means time's up. You
Oh,
want to fly through those last
no.
2 questions quickly?
Yeah, sure. Is there a Carbon component to export these data to Excel or PDF? No, because that. Do you mean like, so? No, I don't think so.
No,
No,
since-
you would rather take that raw data and use it helper like Excel or PDF. Those are kind of moving targets for Carbon to be hitting. That's an example of something where you would want to grab a helper library, either a node helper library or a PDF generation library, someone that can actually specialize in those tools and specialize in that export. And then you'll pass your actual like data that you received here, like this data here, in the same way that you render rows for us, you would likely generate rows for the tooling that exports Excel or PDF. And you can certainly expose a button here that when clicked would run that integration with an Excel or PDF. The reason why we don't include that sort of thing in Carbon Core is because, yeah, it's moving targets. If the Excel or PDF generation libraries change, we don't want to like create dependencies on these tools when we want to leave it up to the developer to choose what they think is the best Excel or PDF generation to suit their needs. Can we sort by column header? Yeah, you absolutely can. And that is something that we have left out of this specific one, of this specific tutorial, mainly for the length of time. But the data table documentation has some excellent resources.
Can you pull
in that
up
regard.
Storybook, and we'll
Certainly.
edit that. React.carbondesignSystem.com and go down to data table. Tomato,
So yeah,
tomato.
with sorting here. So the issue that we have here, and the reason why this becomes complicated, is because if you were to sort here, sort by updated, the data table only knows about the specific rows that are being presented right now. So when you sort here, it's only going to sort the 10 visible rows, which is usually not the intended behavior. So what that means is you have to override the sorting behavior, or you have to augment the sorting behavior to also sort the array of rows that you're passing into the data table component. It's a little bit more convoluted and heavy-handed, so we wanted to make sure that people could just get this, and then if they needed to implement some sort of sorting behavior, they could check out the resources that we have available, our documentation, both here. You'll see on show info, we have like some extra detailed documentation for data table in particular. And then obviously if you guys have any more questions, you can hit us up on Slack or email, what have you. And yeah, so yeah, I would love to keep talking to you guys. I love data fetching. There's some really, really cool things you can do as far as progressively loading data. Like we had 10,000 libraries, you don't want to hold all of those in memory, right? And so you can tell GraphQL when, fetch more. Whenever I'm one, page view short of my limit, go ahead and fetch 10, 100, like 1,000 more repositories, to progressively load data as you need it. And all that data gets cached in memory. It's a really nice experience and way for building applications. So
Sounds great. Well, Vince, we thank you for dropping knowledge.
totally.
Vince loves rendering data. Little hand clap
yes.
for Vince.
Can I share one more thing?
Yeah, what's up?
This is an awesome little, say, for instance, you don't have a GraphQL server, which I would argue is probably a lot of devs out there. You just want to hit one endpoint, and that's super fine. We're going to share this in, it'll be on the website, but I'll also share it in the links as well. This guy writes in basically, I should say his name, but yeah. His name is JavaScript Joel, which is awesome. Yeah, so he basically writes a 20-line, 30-line implementation of the loading error data kind of, API that you get from Apollo, except he does it with, a simple fetch request with a single endpoint. So it's a really neat little component, a little custom hook that we'll share with you guys in case you wanted to experiment doing this with a non-GraphQL implementation.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, we will keep the live chat open if anybody has any follow-up questions, and we will see you on Carbon Dash tutorial on the Slack. Alrighty. Thanks. Have a good day.